Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. To see the Dr. Sophia Rothschild show. And today we have the good fortune of having with us the noted professor of the in anthropology at the University of the West Indies, Professor Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson. Professor, welcome.
Good morning. It's just Doctor Dr. Atkinson. I'm not professor yet.
Okay.
Our system in Jamaica is based off the British system. So our scales are lecturers, senior lecturers, and then professor, which I think would rank with full professor in the US.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, so that is how we are. So Dr. Atkinson or Dr. A, my students call me Dr. A, or Leslie Gale is fine.
Hey, Dr. Atkinson. Well,
Okay.
welcome, welcome. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we want to talk about the very interesting history of Jamaica and the Caribbean, and talk with special reference on the native peoples of Jamaica. Dr. Atkinson, could you tell us who were the first the native peoples of Jamaica? What were they called, and can you tell us anything about how did they got to Jamaica?
Okay, all right. Well, Jamaica, like many, parts of the Caribbean and the Americas, was populated by various ethnic groups. Um, the the Caribbean actually is one of the later regions on the globe to be settled. The Americas, there are debates about, whether North and South America were populated between 25,000 to 40,000 years ago. But the Caribbean wasn't populated until about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. We have islands like Trinidad being the earliest based on radiocarbon dates, which is estimated at 8,000 years ago. But Trinidad's case is different than the rest of us because it was attached to South America, previously. The earliest islands to be populated are Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. Between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. But Jamaica, even though it is only 90 miles from Cuba and 100 miles from Haiti, we didn't have indigenous settlements, at least based on radiocarbon dating, until the 7th century, about 600 AD. There are that's a big, issue in terms of what factors contributed to the late settlement. But in terms of the earliest settlers, indigenous settlers, we have a group known as the Austinoid, who we're not quite sure where they came from. Previously, the scholarship thought they came from, maybe Puerto Rico, but radiocarbon dates realized that the dates in Jamaica are around the same time or probably earlier. So that theory, is questioned now, and more research is needed, to give us more insights in terms of when and where these people came from. So they are what we would call marine foragers, meaning that they settled primarily along the coast. We have a wide, being an island, there's a wide range of resources, terrestrial, we have freshwater, and we also have different types of marine environment. And they are known they're called locally redware because they have this bright reddish orange type of pottery that's associated with them with a nice burnish. And we know that they had, if not full scale agriculture, they had horticulture because they were producing crops like, we call it cassava, you may call it manioc, right? In the Amazon, it's known as yucca. But it's the same. It's the same crop, and they made a bread from that cassava. By about the 10th century, we have the movement into the island from another group, which are known as Mayacoid. And the Mayacoid, they believe, originated from Haiti because the Mayock Valley is there, and they actually colonized, a lot, islands like Jamaica and also the Bahamian archipelago, which includes the Bahamas and also Turks and Caicos and other parts of the region. And there is a big debate in terms of what happened in terms of contact. And one of the flaws we have in anthropology and archaeology is that we always assume that when two cultures make contact, it leads to the demise of another. And we don't really explore the possibility of coexistence or the creation of hybrid cultures as a result of these contacts. So, one of our issues here in Jamaican archaeology is what happened to the earlier group, the Red Ware, the Austinite group. Were they killed out or displaced by the later Mayakoid, which we refer to as white Mal? So in archaeology, the cultures can also be referred to based on the sites that they first observed these traits, right? So we call them site types. So the Red Ware or the Austinoid is known as Little River complex because it was first discovered in Little River St. Anne. And then the Mayakoid type site is White Mal because it was found at White Mal in St. Catherine. All right. And then, so the later group, the Mayakoids, pretty much dominated most of the island, and they successfully settled, widespread areas that the earlier group didn't manage to settle. They looked like they had a mixed economy, so they used terrestrial resources. So there was actually agriculture at that point, and they cultivated root crops, not just cassava, but also sweet potato or batata, crops like tobacco and cotton and others, that were of importance, to their cultural traditions. And of course, they exploited whatever, animals, and also fished and so forth. We have a third group that evolved. So the first two groups are migrants, right? But somehow around the 12th century, 12th, 13th century, another group evolved in Jamaica. That is known as the Montego Bay style or the Fairfield complex because it was first observed in Fairfield, St. James. And those are who we consider the first Jamaicans because everybody came as immigrants. But this culture evolved here on Jamaican soil, and they're particularly found in central and western Jamaica. So parishes like St. Anne, St. James, Westmoreland, and so forth. Interestingly, one of the challenges we have is that most of the pre-colonial or pre-European or prehistoric cultures, we try to move away from the term pre because it ties too much significance with European colonization, and it ignores the fact that these were socially complex societies that existed, and I don't know about your experience, but I find it gives it a kind of like a blank slate that these cultures didn't exist prior to contact. Yeah.
Because a lot of times, for some reason, even in many historians, they just start off with the European settlements, when in reality, like in these islands, there was cultures there for thousands of years previously.
Thousands, yes, because Caribbean culture is a mixture of thousands of years of cultural interaction by all the groups that made these islands their home. But then again, the concept of the Caribbean is not limited to islands because Central and South America does have Caribbean borders with the Caribbean Sea and are part of the concept of the Caribbean. Well, they should be the concept of what we view as the Caribbean. So typically when we think about the pre-European cultures prior to the arrival of the Spanish, particularly in the Greater Antilles, we talk about a culture known as the Taino. That's a very complicated term. There's a lot of disagreement in terms of what Taino means. And one of the challenges we've had here is that I find, especially in public education, they tend to lump everybody as Taino, and that kind of minimizes the range of cultural diversity that probably existed at that time. So they are associated with evolving around 1200 AD up until the arrival of the Europeans, and you do have descendants of the Taino still in the region. Right?
I noticed also in the past there have been the word tossed around called the Arawaks and the Caribs. Can you tell us about them?
Okay, we don't use. All right, so that is okay. So that's problematic terminology. When I was a child, we were introduced to the Arawaks and the Caribs, but there is confusion with ethnic groups in South America. So, for example, the group that they label as Arawak is actually Locono, that is, originated around in within the Amazon. And that's not the name they have. They speak an Arawakan language, and then those that lived in the Greater Antilles and Northern Lesser Antilles were in the 19th century called either Antillean or Island Arawak to distinguish them. But at some point, it seems that either they dropped, the prefixes island and Antillean, and it also led to confusions between the culture that existed in the Amazon and also the cultures in the islands. So the supposed Arawaks in the Greater Antilles are the group that is now referred to as Taino to distinguish it from the mainland culture. I mean, they are possibly descendants and relatives, but they also have similarities, cultural similarities, but they also have cultural distinctions, which makes them a separate ethnic group. And then Carib is viewed as a derogative term, and I know it is listed very abundant in ethnohistoric and historic sources, but the people who we call Carib, they don't use that. They use now the term Kalinago.
Okay.
Right. So that is the term that they use, and they are believed to be descendants of Galena or Carib or Kalinago peoples from South America. They are largely associated with the Lesser Antilles, the Windward and Leeward Islands associated, and they do have descendants that have survived in islands like Dominica and St. Kitts and many other territories. But then the other interesting thing is that many of us may carry these genetic legacies and we're not aware.
Because I noticed that there may be some plan in the future of doing some genetic survey of the people in Jamaica and the Caribbean. Do you know anything about that?
Well, they have there have been different projects over the years. I mean, in the past 30 years, there's a field in anthropology known as genetic anthropology, and in the past we used to focus largely on phenotypes, our genetic legacies that are visible, but what is visible is not a full reality of what you actually carry and what's passed on from generation to generation. So the focus has changed from phenotype studies to more genotype in terms of genomes, your genetic traits. And in the past 30 years, there have been quite a number of projects, particularly in countries like Puerto Rico. And there've also been there've been a few here in Jamaica. There's a genetic anthropologist named Jada Ben-Torres. She's associated with Vanderbilt University. She has done studies in terms of a number of cultures in the countries in the Caribbean, including Jamaica. She did a study at a compound in St. Elizabeth, which is a Maroon settlement. So the Maroons traditionally are believed to be a mixture of the indigenous Americans like the Taino and the Africans, the formerly enslaved Africans who gained their freedom, and they lived in like inaccessible areas across the island. But maroon is not a unique term to Jamaica. Many parts of the Americas, they do have maroon groups, and they kept their freedom through like guerrilla warfare and so forth.
They throw the British out of Jamaica.
Right. So well, scholars like myself believe that the conduit for the indigenous legacies that have survived in islands like Jamaica is the African, particularly the maroon. Whether they had formal unions with them and left genetic legacies or cultural interaction, because a lot of our traditions are still indigenous.
Sure, yeah.
Yes. So yes, there have been studies, and she has an article with Harcourt Fuller, I think around 2018, that highlighted evidence of indigenous American DNA in terms of the mitochondrial DNA. That's what we inherit from our mothers at a compound. We've been talking for a long time about wanting, a wider study on other maroon territories and also non-maroon communities, because people may not necessarily know their genetic background. We're not only products of our parents, we are hundreds of couples,
Yes.
in whose legacies we still carry. Yeah. Some we know, some we don't know.
Interestingly, I noticed that based on the geological evidence, the Caribbean area, the sea level was much lower. As you previously alluded to it, the countries like Trinidad and Tobago was one land bridge linking it to South America, and that's the crossover from South America into the Caribbean area. And it's as you see the rise, they get cut off.
Yes.
Could you talk to us about how the
migration routes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the Caribbean has a very I would say it's a very strategic location, because it's in the middle of North, Central, and South America, and as a result of that, there are many routes into the Caribbean. So a possible route could have been from the south of Florida into islands like the Bahamas, and then even into Cuba. Other routes could be from Central America, anywhere from Mexico all the way to Panama. That's because they also had what were known as mid-Caribbean islets around that time when you were talking about, when the sea level was lower. So that would have been, so the current epoch that we live in is the Holocene, and that started about 11,700 years ago. And prior to that, we had the Pleistocene, which was what we refer to as the Ice Age. That cartoon series, the Ice Age, is depicting with all the megafauna. So at that time, there would be a lot in terms of more access, in terms of land bridges, islands that we know would have been, larger in size. So even if you look at a map in the Caribbean, usually the areas depicted in a very, very light blue refers to, possible land, at levels if the sea level dropped by about 150, meters or more. All right. So that mid-Caribbean islets, they existed, and some of them still exist. So islands like Cayman are believed to have been legacies of that, but they are now submerged with the Holocene and the warming of the earth. The glaciers melted and the sea level rised. So there's also, in addition to from Central America into islands like Cuba and Jamaica, there's also South America. And there are many ways they can enter the region. So they can enter through the Lesser Antilles, through Trinidad, going up the Lesser Antilles, or they can go across to the ABC Islands, the Netherlands Islands, and Aruba, and Curacao, and so forth, and then they can travel northward to islands like Jamaica. So those are the main routes that are possible. But based on the archaeological evidence, no, we only have evidence of two routes. And that is based on like stone tools or human remains and things like that. So we have evidence from Lesser Antilles up from South America to the Greater Antilles, and then we also have evidence of some connection with Central America. They're not quite sure. We used to think it was from the Yucatan Peninsula into Cuba, but no, we believe it's much lower down geographically. Um, probably places like Costa Rica and so forth.
One of the one of the things that people always ask about is that what were the social structures of the Taino people?
The
Like
Taino.
the
Okay, so they
hierarchy,
had
hierarchy,
right.
how did that how was it like?
Okay, so they had a class structure. They subdivided themselves into two main groups, Nitaino, which is the elite group or the nobility, so to speak. So, and then you have what is the Nabaria, which is the working people. Um, we don't perceive them as being enslaved, so we don't really have evidence of slavery existing. But there is definitely a working class group. So within the Nitaino, you would have had the cacique, and the cacique is usually depicted as the chief or the head. So let me go back. So each island is a political entity in itself,
Yeah.
right? And then they didn't have a universal name like how we call ourselves Caribbean or West Indian. They took their names and identity associated with their islands. So for example, Locayo is a name of a Bahamian island. Cuba is believed to be, Taino, and that name survives. And Haiti, what we associate as Haiti. Islands like Puerto Rico, Boricua, or Boricua,
Yeah.
are the Taino names. And then Jamaica would be Yamaye. And then Ka is believed to be an indigenous American suffix that suggests location. So that is how Jamaica and evolves to Jamaica. All right. So within the island, they then were subdivided into like regions or chiefdoms. Those were further subdivided into districts. And then at the lowest level, you had villages, which they call Yukayeke. Yucca, as I mentioned before, means cassava. So it also demonstrates how important that crop was to all aspects of their society. And for each of these political units, they had different levels of cacique. So you would have a chief for the village, and then each district comprises of many villages, and you have, a higher level cacique in charge of that district, and then a higher level in charge of like the chiefdom or the regions, right? And then no, in addition to the cacique, the chief, so the female can be either cacica or keskeani. Contemporary time, use keskeani, but in the sources we've seen cacica. Um, so we do have women. So I'm very happy that we do have women who headed, and there are historical records like Anna Kawana is famously known. Her name means golden flower. Um, has been recorded in the historical sources as a female leader. She unfortunately had a tragic end though, but still she lived. Um, and then below the cacique, you would have other people like what is known as a behike, or like a shaman. So they served like a religious and also as a healer. um, kind of like a twin role.
Like,
So yeah, so he or she served as like an intermediary between their deities and the living realm in terms of the general people and so forth. And then we know, well, there's a lot of debates in terms of the size of the villages, like how many people. So some sources may say as much as 1,000 or 2,000. But I think it varies with the terrain and it varies with the island, because it would also depend on what resources they had around that could support it, and some of their villages lasted for hundreds of years and some were probably just temporary. So for example, in Jamaica, White Mile, that site dates from the 9th century to contact, and we have evidence in the archaeology from those earliest periods up to contact with the Spanish and after.
yeah,
Mhm.
so in essence, you had a noble that
Mhm.
that runs the island, and then below you have chieftains uh,
Mhm.
that kind of handle the governance, and then you had a shaman that did
Right. Or
healing.
Behike, yes, the healers, yes.
Okay.
And so their religion is polytheistic. But it's a little, it also is it kind of mixes with animism and spirit, because they had a lot of spirits, in terms of they believe nature was animated, so for example they may have spirit of the cassava, spirit of the tree, spirit of the night, and then they so it almost seems like it was a pantheon because it was kind of in some sort of hierarchy. And at the top of the hierarchy, you had Yukaho, who was their supreme deity. He was the spirit of the cassava. And in many cultures, they depict their deities as being omnipresent and omnipotent and stuff. And he has many names, and one of them is Huracan, um, which is where we get hurricane from. You know, um, yes. So of course, there are certain checks and balances in the society. They honor their deities through some sort of tribute, also their cacique through some sort of tribute system. And then, when they have failed to live up to what is required of them, unfortunately, there are certain sanctions. And I guess that is the way they perceive natural disaster, which I don't really think is that unique. Many humans feel that way.
Atkinson, I'm gonna do a quick pause, and then we're gonna
Mhm.
start the second session, right?
Okay, sure, no problem.